My name is Claudia Webbe, and I'm the Labour Party Member of Parliament for Leicester East. It's of course a pleasure to chair this evening's important event with such an inspiring range of speakers. And as you may know, the Labour Party has opened its consultation on policy via the National Policy Forum. The Cosmos is running a series of events to discuss how members can make submissions to defend and develop a manifesto based on socialist values. Today, we have an excellent range of speakers covering a whole range of issues. And our three themes this evening focus on three areas of the policy forum. Our three policy commissions include housing, transport and local government, the economy, business and trade, and the environment, energy and culture. And I just want to, in paying tribute to our speakers who I'll introduce one by one this evening, I just want to pay a special tribute and mention to one of tonight's speakers, Tosh McDonald, who has done so much over the past 5 years to move the dial of economic consensus back towards fundamental human decency after a decade of brutal austerity. You know, the 2015 process where John took control of the economic policy of a Labour Party that did not oppose austerity, capitulated to the right-wing narratives and did not offer a genuinely alternative vision for a fairer society. You know, together with Jeremy, Diane Abbott and many of others, they reconnected the Labour Party to its socialist roots. And I can't thank them enough for that. So thanks also to their grassroots campaigning, we are now the biggest left-wing membership party in Europe. And they have inspired a generation of young people to join the political process and fight for their future. The economic policy, goes without saying, that John developed over the last 5 years has demonstrated to us that we don't have to accept the unjust status quo, that it is possible to fight against systems of oppression and that together we can achieve real change. That's why it's so important for Labour members to engage with the National Policy Forum to defend and expand this radical policy programme. So I look forward to hearing from our excellent range of speakers tonight about how we can achieve that aim. So without further ado, I'm going to open up our range of speakers. And our first speaker is a Doncaster councillor, but it hasn't always been so. He's a trade union veteran, and he will provide a general overview, and he will obviously encourage us all. Our first speaker is Tosh McDonald. So over to you, Tosh.
Thanks, Claudia. Have I unmuted myself properly?
I think you have.
That's good. That's good. Oh, just great what you were saying. Some of the things you were saying there about the inspiration of young people, and a thing came to my mind. We had Jeremy in his first leadership election campaign here in Doncaster. We booked a big room in the Trades and Labour Club, thinking, have we gone too far here? And we ended up having to use the lounge as well as the concert room and run two meetings at once. And there was a young guy we met then, a young Kurdish lad, and he's so good. Emery is his name. And tomorrow he celebrates his 15th birthday. That's the generation that Jeremy Corbyn's leadership campaign brought in. I also have to say that I think it was 2006 when John McDonnell tried to get on the leadership ballot when Gordon Brown was coronated. And I remember my wife Nikki was going through cancer treatment at that time, but went up to Newcastle to speak a meeting with John, supporting John, because Aslef supported him, wanted to get him on the ballot paper. And in Newcastle on a sunny Saturday afternoon, where people should have been out enjoying themselves, drinking beer, whatever they want to do in Newcastle. But the big hotel on the station hotel, the room we had was packed. Every seat was taken. all the aisles were full and there were even people stood in the corridors. So the feeling's been there. Socialist policies will bring people to Labour. And the opposite is true as well, I'm afraid, that if we don't stick with the socialist policies that we've developed over the recent years, we will lose people to Labour. And we will lose seats as well. I mean, I think there's a danger. I live in Doncaster, it's up in the Red Wall, as it's called. And we've took some hits in this last election. But you know, we can win them back if we stay united and say we're offering something to people, working class people in the former industrial areas. If we ignore them at our peril, we can see the Red Wall, the north of England, going the same way as Scotland. So it's important that we do defend and we get members to embrace with the National Policy Forum and defend the fantastic policies that we have got. Now, I know there's some fantastic speakers going to follow me, some academics and intellectuals who can give far more analytical detail than I can. I give it from my heart. I give it from my heart. And what makes me want to stick to socialism, what makes me want to stick to the kind of policies we have, is the way I was brought up. I had a strange upbringing. My mum left when I was 3. I never saw her or my sister again. There was me and my dad. He was a bit of a wild card. He died when he was 38. I was 11 when I found him dead. From that point, I had a tremendous life because I was brought up by my grandparents, both born in 1907. They lived through the general strike. My grandfather was a miner. He moved south for work in the pit, so that's what he said. My grandmother said he owed people money, and that's why he kept moving. But the truth's somewhere in the middle there. But my grandfather used to tell me about things that he saw in the village where he was in the 1926 strike, about the brutality of the state, where the police came into a miner's cottage, and his wife, in the language of the day, was bedridden, as they say. She was an invalid in bed. And she was screaming as the police came in, and a copper hit her with a stick across the face, saying, "Take that, you parish-fed bastard." My grandfather told me about people waiting at pit gates, factory gates, at the docks, hoping to get jobs. He was proud that they got rid of that. You know, he was proud of the things that they did. And my grandfather's generation, one of the things he used to tell me about was that in 1945, they got rid of their austerity. They did it against all odds. We weren't just running a deficit, the country was bankrupt. And we developed the National Health Service, nationalised the pits, the railways. We had all the utilities in public ownership. We built the welfare state and the National Health Service. That's what we did. And my grandfather, when he was in a good mood, would spend all his time telling me about those things. Now, I started work then on railway in 1979. It was actually a month after Thatcher was elected as Prime Minister. And I always say I hated her, what she did to the communities that I lived and worked in. When I started on the railway, every day we moved coal from the northern coalfield to power stations, or to sometimes to the deep sea port at Immingham to export it all over the world. We owned the pits where the coal was dug. We owned the railways that moved the coal. We owned the power stations that turned that coal into electricity and distributed it. And they didn't distribute it where there was profit to be made. It was where it was needed. It would be to factories, to schools, to hospitals, and to homes. Most of those homes are what we built and owned as well. Give people secure tenancies for the whole life and for the next generation's life, where they were maintained by people directly employed with good terms, good conditions, people who could, whether they were bricklayers, whether they were carpenters, roofers, painters. That's where we were. We owned all the utilities. And that was fantastic. Then I saw it being dismantled after I started. I saw the things that Thatcher did, and I really did hate it, and I really did set my alarm an hour early so I could hate it for an hour longer. That's not just a joke, it's how it was. And that feeling is still here, you know, in the north of England. You must remember that when Thatcher died, in the village just outside Doncaster at Moorthorpe, they actually had an effigy of her, and they had a funeral, they burnt her. The whole of the village was out, and you can find this on YouTube. You can Google it and find it in Moorthorpe. The whole village was out to celebrate the death of Thatcher. That's how much we hated her. So imagine what it takes for people in those communities, because the pits might have gone, but there's still sons of miners, there's still daughters of miners, grandsons and granddaughters who remember that year and what we went through. For people in some of those areas to turn against Labour and vote for the Tories must be something extreme. And I think in the north of England, the biggest culprit was the Brexit position of the Labour Party. But Jeremy Corbyn had been demonised, the decent man demonised for 4 years. That must have had an effect as well. But you know, if we remember the 2017 election. We came so close, and we now know if it weren't for the actions of some people in position in the party, we could have won, or could have at least been the government. We might not have had a majority, but we could have had the government, and we could have won. And we need to get back to those policies and back to that kind of an attitude where we get people excited about Labour Party and about its politics. You know, I remember many, many things that happened during the miners' strike. I can remember the village I was living in, Armthorpe, being sealed off by the police. I couldn't get home from work. And I'm also proud that during that year-long strike, there wasn't one shovel of coal that moved by rail in that area. I'm proud of ASLEF, of the RMT, or NUR as it was in the time, and the fact that we stood by our colleagues and the people we sat in working men's clubs at a night with and supported them. I want to see us building council houses. You know, I went on the LBC. I think it was the guy, Andrew, what's his name? He was Andrew Castle. He wasn't a very good tennis player, and he's not a very good interviewer, I don't think, now. But it was after John McDonnell had announced the broadband everywhere, and how visionary it was. And the most visionary thing about it, I said, was the fact that there was starting where there's no profit to be made in the most isolated places. That's what socialism can do. That's what we need to get back to. And he was trying to belittle it. He was trying to belittle it. But you know, the guy who was on, you're listening on the radio interview, and the guy who was on before me was from the Broadband Providers or Internet Providers Association. And he was saying, I don't know what the problem is. We're delivering all this internet, we're doing it. Obviously, there are some parts of the country where it's not practical for us to do it, and the government will have to step in then. It made the argument for me. Now, I believe where we were, whether it be tuition fees, whether it be making sure we bring the railways back into public ownership, and there's nothing more obvious than that. When we look at when East Coast was brought into public ownership properly, it put £1 billion back into Exchequer. You know, all the ratings were going up on it. It was fantastic. Then we get it renationalised again, supposedly, but it was given to another organisation that was running it. It weren't actually in public ownership properly. But we see when things have gone wrong with coronavirus, we see the policies that we needed, that we were espousing, having to be done. They've had to bring many train companies into public ownership. Even before coronavirus, they were talking about and threatening more or less straight away to bring Northern Rail back into public ownership, because private ownership doesn't work. It only works in the areas where somebody can make a profit out of it. What we should be doing is, if we have all the utilities and things in public ownership, if somebody's working on it and it can't be making a profit, then the others can subsidise it. You know, if water is needing a lot of investment in, but electricity is making a lot of money, then the money that's been made in electricity can be paying for the upgrade of the water industry. Now, I know as a local councillor, I see things quite a bit differently to when I was a national president of a trade union. I can say things are very different. And I must say that it's very hard, it's really hard for local authorities, Labour authorities, who have seen in Doncaster, we've seen our budget halved over a number of years, and still trying to provide the services we can. Now, with coronavirus, if the government can find the money, they can find the money tree. We were right to say the money is there, we invest. It's not about borrowing, it's about investing, and we can do that. I think we need to stick to those policies. I also believe if we don't get the members involved, get the members and the CLPs writing to the National Policy Forum and talking about how we need to keep those progressive policies that we came about, then we're going to find that people will move away. I have a fear in the north of England going the same way as Scotland if we don't do it. So I think for our party to survive, we have to get those good socialists within the Labour Party to get involved and to get writing, CLPs writing, and putting propositions to the National Policy Forum, because we have to admit there has been a change with the change of leadership. I find it hard when after we finished yesterday, I'm going watching George Floyd's memorial service. It was heartbreaking. Obviously, we've all seen the things on television, heartbreaking. I find it heartbreaking that we've had allegations of racism within our party and nothing seems to be happening. They're telling us that there is going to be a investigation. As a trade unionist, part of negotiating a number of equalities policies in different workplaces, the one point that was always there was if there's an allegation made and the person the allegation's made against is put on investigatory suspension. It's not discipline, it's there to protect those who the allegation's been made against and those who allege they've been mistreated in whatever way. That's not happening. And I find it hard to understand when that's in the ACAS code of practice throughout. We need to keep our policies alive. That's going to mean us on the ground getting involved and keeping the policies alive, because I think we have seen such a shift to the right in the shadow cabinet. We've seen a shift to the right. I don't like the way the new General Secretary was pushed forward as the favourite son, if you like, of the new leader. I think that was a very anti-democratic thing to do. And again, I think we've moved very much to the right. So it's up to us. Nobody is going to do it for us. Us and those great members of the Parliamentary Labour Party who have stood by principles throughout. I know from talking to other MPs and stuff, some of the horrendous times that good socialist MPs went through in the PLP meetings, the abuse that they suffered. Fantastic. My hat off to them. I think they've been great, they've been strong and they've been solid, but they're going to need us on the ground floor supporting them, because there is going to be a move away from that, I believe, from the leadership of the party. So it's up to us to hold their feet to the fire, to make sure we stick to those fantastic policies. When the 2017 manifesto, I was there at Bradford University when it was announced, and all the students up on every tier up there watching it, we were talking about getting rid of those horrendous tuition fees. We can't trust anybody else. We can't trust the Lib Dems. They've shown that. I was so sad when I saw the Greens made sort of an electoral pact with the Lib Dems in the last election, and there's only Labour can do it, and there's only us on the left, activists in CLPs and elsewhere, who can hold the feet to the fire of the new leadership. I hope I haven't gone on too long. Thank you.
No, that was absolutely brilliant, Tosh. I mean, just remind us how such an important voice you are in Doncaster, and the people of Doncaster must be truly. It's truly brilliant for you to be the councillor there in Doncaster, and they must be benefiting hugely from the experience that you are giving and you are presenting. And thank you for sharing your story, really, in terms of your background, your story, how it's relevant and how it just resonates that actually these policies, these socialist values and policies, they existed, and we can, in a sense, relive them, and how important it is that if we have a socialist, maintain our socialist values, people will come to the Labour Party. And in a sense, how you've highlighted the George Floyd incident in the States, and how systemic and structural racism still exists, and how we should be reminded of that, and the importance really of just our socialist values and moving forward. I want to thank you, Tosh, for that outline and setting the stage for us today, such an important stage. I just want to remind people, those of you who are with us, we've got a huge number of you with us, but I wouldn't just remind you, if you want to pose a question, there is a question and answer section that you'll find hopefully in the bottom of your screen, and you can pose a question and we will have an ability to be able to put questions to our speakers in just a moment or so, once we've heard from more of our speakers. I just want to move to our first themed commission, really, and that is our commission around housing, around transport, and around local government, and bring in our speaker, our first speaker in relation to that particular commission. Our first speaker is Ian Taylor on this matter. Ian was a policy advisor to Andy McDonnell, the former Shadow Secretary of State for Transport, as you will know him. And so it's really a delight to introduce to you Ian Taylor. So over to you, Ian.
Thank you very much, Claudia. Can you hear me?
We can hear you. We can hear you very well. Go ahead.
Fantastic. I was particularly asked to talk about how to make our travel environmentally friendly and transport the environment, and I will do that. But as a director of an organisation with the name Transport for Quality of Life, I will, as you'd expect, also say that the social benefits of providing really good, sustainable transport can and should go hand in hand with the environmental benefits. For this talk, I'm going to concentrate on surface transport, not aviation or shipping. Happy to discuss other issues in the Q&A. My approach is going to be to try to provide a big picture, radical themes and opportunities that I think we should collectively push in the National Policy Forum submissions as a membership base. Having sat on the other side of the fence where the NPF ideas are arriving, I can say that the valuable role of the NPF is not to get into the detail, for example, how to get a few more bikes onto trains, much as that would be good, but to push for radical things and make valuable argument space for the leadership to do the right thing. For that, what is needed is a coherent, strong and loud NPF voice. So the following that I'm going to go into is trying to pull out what I think are the 10 big themes. So number one, it is vital that transport policy is founded in recognition of the climate emergency and is founded on carbon budgets. Transport is the rogue sector with the worst record on emissions. If the election had gone the other way, I can assure you Labour, Andy McDonnell, would have put carbon budgets at the foundation of transport policy. Amongst other matters, that means, crucially, abolishing the present Department for Transport spending priority of spending £90 billion on building new roads by 2035. That will increase traffic and emissions in exactly the crucial period they need to go down in order to save the climate. Instead, we should spend the money on public transport and provision for safe travel using bicycles and on foot. Number two, secondly, we have to recognise that electric cars are not enough. Even with the most wildly optimistic scenarios for uptake of electric vehicles, we need to reduce car use substantially and get people to make their journeys by other means. Climate targets actually require less car use by a minimum of 20% and possibly up to 60%. This means a huge change in thinking. Then I'm going to outline what I see as the key elements of that thinking, then I'll say a little bit more about each one. So, number three, we need to recognise a universal basic right to excellent public transport and walking and cycling facilities. Fourth, we need to set guaranteed public service standards for places everywhere, according to their size, something that's done already in parts of Switzerland. Number five, in turn, to implement that, it is essential that we re-regulate buses and take ownership of more buses and trains. Number six, for it all to fit together as a single system so that people can get easily from any place to any other place, we need what might be called a total timetable approach, covering the whole country and all modes of transport, all modes of public transport. Also something that Switzerland does, so perhaps it's best called a Swiss-style timetable. 7, we should have free public transport, at least in some places and for some people. Number 8, there should be an eco-levy on driving, at least where there is free public transport. Number 9, we must exploit new sources of funding for public transport and walking and cycling as used in other countries. And number 10, all of this is in the context of switching spending to align with carbon budgets for transport, which, as I've already said, means totally abolishing the Tories' plans to spend £90 billion wasting money building roads and instead spend it on sustainable transport. So, 10 points, just to put a bit more flesh on those bones, and there's limited time, but at Transport for Quality of Life, we believe there should be a universal basic right to live well without recourse to a car. And that in turn means a universal basic right to excellent public transport and to excellent provision for making trips on foot or on a bike. This may sound radical, and it certainly needs to be, if we're going to meet the climate emergency, in which transport is, as I said, the rogue sector, the worst performing. But in fact, it is doable. And some countries are actually already doing some of what is needed. So let's look at a few of the more encouraging examples, starting with public transport, then moving on to walking and cycling. A universal basic right to excellent public transport means services that are sufficiently comprehensive that is a feasible, indeed an attractive option, more attractive than the car, to make journeys from pretty much any place A to any place B by public transport. Where's that true at the moment? Well, in various parts of Northern Europe, there are transport associations, and in Germany, Austria, Switzerland, where these exist, Verkehrsverbund is the German name, and they do a pretty good job of it. These transport associations cover areas that are bigger than the so-called combined authorities in England, many of them with much more rural areas included, but they manage to achieve levels of public transport use per capita, per person, that are 2 or 3 or 4 times those in our combined authorities. If Britain's urban areas were to achieve the same levels of public transport use, we would be cutting carbon emissions from cars by something like 9 or 10%. A huge and hugely important step when you consider transport emissions haven't fallen significantly from 1990 levels. A universal basic right to public transport implies underpinning that by legally guaranteed levels of service. This is already the approach in parts of Switzerland. So let's look at the situation in Zurich canton, some parts of which are actually quite rural. So there's a tiny place, picking one at random, called Berg am Echel, has only 500 inhabitants, but it is guaranteed, like every settlement in the canton, of over 300 people, an hourly service. In fact, it gets 2 services per hour. It gets buses from 6 a.m. in the morning until just before midnight, every day of the week, including Sundays. The bus services go to the nearest train line and they connect. Yes, they really do connect. Remember that concept? Buses at rural stations arrive 3 minutes before the trains and they leave after. How sensible. And they connect with trains going to the nearest large place, in this case Winterthur, and then to Zurich. We need this sort of approach. We also need to do what the Swiss do and establish a national timetable based on the rail timetable, so that the reach of the railway, as you might call it, into its rural hinterland is massively increased. In fact, the timetable in Switzerland is so important, the national timetable, it goes to the cabinet for its final approval. So how do these countries do so much better than us? Well, of course, they have regulated systems where bus companies are regulated. No other country would dream of being as stupid as we've been since Margaret Thatcher when she stopped local authorities determining what buses were needed where. Indeed, most of the Verkehrsverbund, the transport associations, they not only regulate the bus services, but they own and run their bus services, plus trams and trains as often as not. We should do the same. That means that all the services from buses, trams, tubes, trains work together. In Munich Transport Association, they have a splendid simple motto: one network, one timetable, one ticket. Super sensible, sounds easy, doesn't it? We can't do it. We don't have a hope of doing that with our rival, mutually hostile private bus companies doing what they like. So if we want to make the business case for a new tram, it's undermined because private bus companies like to run against it in competition with it rather than feed into it. That's what used to happen with the Newcastle Metro, but was destroyed by Margaret Thatcher's 1985-1986 bus deregulation and privatisation. Bus deregulation is one of the biggest and most underappreciated reasons Britain lags the rest of the world, the rest of Europe particularly, in installing modern tram systems. Taking ownership of buses, in fact, would be a very easy step now, because we've got to a situation where, from where before coronavirus, over 40% of bus industry revenues anyway came from public money. They came from reimbursement for all people's bus use. They came from a thing called the Bus Service Operating Grant, and directly supported non-commercial services that local authorities tried to fill gaps in the network with. Now the lion's share is in the public purse. It is being paid for by the public. So for that, we should be getting majority shares of bus ownership and switching the whole of the country to the London-style franchising, from which it is a very easy step to switch each route to be run by 100% publicly owned operators as soon as we have those. So in this respect, COVID-19 is a really big opportunity. And if you go for this level of investment in quality, what is the quid pro quo? Well, we should say, we should incentivize people to switch from driving by applying eco-levies on driving. And we say do that first in the urban areas and link it with what is happening now in more than 100 cities around the world, making public transport fare free. Dunkirk implemented free public transport for its buses, that's what they have there, last year. It's seen bus use increase 85%, nearly double. And encouragingly, half of the new users are switching from cars. Interesting that Dunkirk did this not for environmental reasons, but actually for economic reasons, to boost the city's economy. And this has, I think, lessons for a lot of our ailing towns. Doncaster might be one of them, Tosh. Better provision for people walking and using bikes is essential. We think the potential for cutting emissions is much underestimated. It is estimated by modelling that if we had the same culture of cycling, the same quality of infrastructure as the Dutch, and the similar support for electrically assisted bikes, we would be cutting about 30% of emissions from cars. And that, I should say, does allow for the added hilliness of Britain. I should also point out that the Dutch haven't always had a cycling culture. They did lose it. It was only after good campaigning they got it back. Instead of investing, as the Tories plan, in building lots of new roads that destroy open countryside and that will increase traffic, we should do what Copenhagen's doing, building really good segregated cycle routes alongside their trunk road routes. If you plot the Copenhagen routes onto a map of London, they extend to beyond St Albans and Potters Bar, and they're replacing long car commutes. The average bike trip on those routes is 15 kilometres. As it happens, with COVID-19, we're beginning to see major road space reallocation from vehicles to walking and cycling on major roads, unheard of before. Completely unheard of. It is vital that we retain this temporary allocation on a permanent basis. We're getting at the moment a vision of the future we need to save the climate, to have clean air in our towns and cities, to get rid of our traffic noise in our urban areas, and to all have the means to travel safely and healthily. Labour has to endorse this and say it will make it permanent. And to do all of this, we need not just an eco-levy on driving to fund it, we need to recognise that our transport system should be supported by money from a lot of organisations and people who do benefit from it, but don't pay for it in the same ways they do in other countries. That is the rationale behind the so-called versement transport, a payroll levy used in France, completely responsible for the renaissance in trams in France. That means that employers support the transport system that delivers their employees to their doors. And another thing would be the visitor taxes that are used to support public transport spending in many countries. Britain needs something similar to both of these things, and these speak also to giving much greater fundraising powers to devolved authorities and local authorities. I'm nearly finished, but I'd like to ask our technical guru, Peter, to put up a diagram that summarises this, and if all goes according to plan, it will just put some things together. Okay, well, I'm sorry this looks a bit intimidating, but it's very much what I've just been running through. The climate emergency is the foundation of transport policy. This is what I hope we can all reflect in submissions to the National Policy Forum. Coming down the right-hand side there, a universal basic right to public transport, and that follows the need for Swiss-style service standards everywhere, and from that follows the need to regulate and incentivise public ownership and investment. From that, or complementary to that, is getting a national style Britain-wide timetable. And coming down the left-hand side, if you're going to make the climate emergency your foundation, you must have carbon budgets, and then you must bring your financial budgets in line with that. And John McDonnell would have done this as Chancellor of the Exchequer if he'd had the chance. That means you kill the road building budget, you divert it to sustainable modes, you bring in money from other sources, you have a massive transformative investment, and then you bring in, yes, some eco-levies that incentivise not driving, and you use that money and other monies to implement fare, free public transport where it makes sense. That's been a very quick run through, but thank you for your time and your attention, everyone.
That was absolutely amazing, Ian. Absolutely amazing. I know that we've got a number of people that are saying this is actually inspirational, and they want to know where they can get more, where they can get a copy or more information about what you've just presented. And I think we've answered that in the question and answer. If you go to the website for the Cosmos, we're going to be posting all of these presentations there, and Ian's wonderful presentation that he went through just now will hopefully be there too. But that was a tremendous outline of the importance of how we can move transport really towards meeting that green sort of climate, addressing that the sort of the climate the climate emergency that we all face, and how we can move transport towards that and address that. I just want to maybe take, I think we've got one or two questions that we could probably take just before we bring in our next speaker. I think actually, no, what I'll do is I'll go straight to our next speaker, and then because I know, Ian, you're leaving. So this is why I'm going to bring in some questions, because I know that you've got to leave us. So I just want to sort of look at one or two questions that might be useful for you to answer, Ian. So we've got a question here from Carmen. Let me see if I've understood this question correctly. But Carmen says, and this is directly for Ian, why instead of taxation that wealthy individuals simply would pay? Why rather than taxation, and rather than introduce a limit to how many miles each individual can travel using private transport by road? Wealthy individuals then would be forced to buy miles from those that don't use it. Is that a question, Ian, you can possibly look at for us?
This comes back to the debate as to whether you should have an individual sort of allowance of carbon, and that should apply equally to everyone. And there are a lot of good arguments for that. And people like Mayor Hillman have been advocating this for many, many years. And I think, if you do go with systems of eco-levies to pay for, to pay per mile for driving, so they see the cost of it there, in fact, that is not incompatible with going with a system where you have individual carbon budgets and allowances. The question from Carmen was actually proposing that these be tradable and people can pay for them and that sort of thing. Of course, in a way, the most equitable system is just that you do have absolute rations, and that's it. However rich you are, that's your limit on how much carbon you can burn. There's arguments in both directions there, but no, I would be in favour of that sort of thing. And to pick up another question, I noticed that there were people, someone's asked a question about the HS2, which I haven't tackled, but let's tackle that. If Andy had been Shadow Secretary of State for Transport, he would have supported getting high-speed rail, but he would have wanted to see the specifications change and the way it's done change. I see it as one of the things that is, in the longer run, something which can challenge domestic aviation, and it's important in that role. That means, in fact, making sure that it does reach Scotland, it does get to Glasgow and Edinburgh, and provide these. The evidence is that from around the world, if you can get city centre links, and HS2 should do city centre, not be out of the way, then you can kill the aviation flight market over the same distance. It's flights of 2 to 3, well, the equivalent to train journeys on high speed is 2 to 3 hours. And I can see there's a question coming up saying, well, Switzerland's different. It's rural areas of Switzerland. I would beg to differ with that, actually. Although I'm happening to be part of this conversation from one of the most rural counties in Britain, in Powys, where I've lived for 20 years without a car, excuse me, up a hill in Powys. Actually, the vast majority of, certainly England, is, if not only lightly rural, it's not deep rural, and a lot of it actually is sort of dormitory to the nearest regional area and is what you might call peri-urban. I think we need to be careful about not defining the problem so it's impossible. So urban, rural is a gross simplification. There's a vast sort of area in between, people living in suburbs and peri-urban areas, which in fact are very amenable to the sort of approach that Switzerland is talking about. And then there's people saying, well, you can't do it by buses, you've got to bring in, what about opening new railway stations? I'm all in favour of that, but actually what I was talking about the way that you extend the reach of the railway by making sure that you've got a timetable that extends right across the buses so things actually connect, a concept that we've lost, is vital to that. If you're going to make the case for new railway lines, build it on the sort of model that I was laying out, because that is where you'll get your value for money. That's, the reach of the railway in Switzerland into its rural hinterland by having these connections and a national timetable and publicly owned operators. It's hugely more than our railway, where it doesn't connect with buses. The train operators don't even agree with each other where they're going to have transfers. So trying to pick up a few of the questions there, but they'll keep on coming, I'm afraid.
Okay.
So,
Thanks for that. Do you have time for one or two more of those questions?
yep.
Do you want to? There's one here just about can we encourage the car-free cities movement alongside development of public transport? But you know, can we wait for a Labour government to make these major changes? I guess it's, you know, what can we do now?
Yeah.
Do you want to?
I think this actually links very well to the situation with the coronavirus, because I think if one thing it is showing is that things that people had assumed were impossible are in fact possible. And we're not getting full car-free cities, which would be good, but we're getting parts of that. And I think there's a richness of urban environment that people are beginning to experience again, you know, and we're showing that culture can be changed. Car-free cities movement, fantastic. We get bits of that. Regent Street gets shut from now and again in London. There's, you know, we've seen, some people have seen anyway, the situation in Paris where certain days have become car-free and this sort of thing. There's I think getting people to experience these things and get in there and support it is crucially important. I mean, I know from sitting in Andy McDonnell's office that the kind of motoring lobby bogeyman is huge with all politicians ever since the year 2000 with the fuel protests. And it is for us as the membership to say, look, actually there's a very vocal lobby there, but there's a whole load of us who actually see it differently. You know, and the statistics are interesting about drivers. One of my colleagues at Transport for Quality of Life did some of the pioneering research on what drivers actually think. And if you go and ask drivers, the interesting thing is that there's only about a quarter of them that are what you could call die-hard drivers, the Jeremy Clarksons of this world. There's about half of drivers would rather not be driving. And that is a perspective that most politicians have not been accustomed to, because all they hear from is the vocal minority. And it's for us to put these other perspectives about the value of car-free cities. It's a good question to ask. Thank you.
Ian, that is absolutely brilliant. You have really tremendously outlined what we can do in terms of transport and how we can hold on to those fabulous policies that you were developing with Andy when he was in his role under Jeremy's leadership. Can I just thank you for everything that you have presented to us this evening? And I know you've made a special effort, really, and that we won't hold you back any longer. I won't announce from what we've kept you, but I know that it's really important that you make haste. But thank you so much. And I know that the tremendous work that Andy, that you've done with Andy, I'm sure in his new role as Shadow Secretary of State for Employment Rights and Protections, that indeed he will make just hopefully just as good an impact, that we'll all be watching very carefully what he does in that role. But thank you so much, and please stay in touch. It's brilliant. Thank you. And we'll make sure that the presentation you've made is on thecosmos.co.uk. That's where you'll find all the brilliant work that Ian Taylor has just outlined for us. So thank you once again. I just want to now move us to our next set of speakers. And our next speaker indeed is Carol Wilcox, and Carol is going to our next speaker is actually Councillor Gary Parker, and Councillor Gary Parker from Greenwich is going to bring together the housing, transport and local government agenda through looking at regeneration and local government and what that means in terms of community wealth building. So can I hand over to Councillor Gary Parker without any further ado. So over to you, Gary.
Thank you, Claudia. Can everybody hear me okay? Good.
Yes.
My name is Gary Parker. I'm a councillor in the London Borough of Greenwich. I'm also chair of the Regeneration Scrutiny Panel. I have a background in social policy, economic development and regeneration consultancy, and have worked with many and continue to work with many grassroots organisations and small businesses professionally. As I've only got a few minutes here, I'm going to focus on the Housing, Local Government and Transport Policy Commission with reference to local economic development, which takes in a number of areas. Can I just say though, before I start, I was very much inspired by Tosh's contribution. Like him, I'm a northerner, but I'm based in London, and we all share the same socialist values. They are our rock. But my view is we need to roll that rock into the 21st century, because we're now in a period that's very, very fluid. And in a sense, the new socialism of the 21st century is still being born, and we have to progress down that road. So most commentators are agreed in the aftermath of the pandemic that we're heading for a significant economic downturn in the UK and beyond. So local economic development is going to become even more important. Unlike some other sections of the National Policy Forum, we haven't seen the watering down of socialist principles and policies that we've seen elsewhere. However, there are some key principles and policies that we need to reaffirm and to ensure that they're continued and that they're not watered down. I'm going to concentrate on 5 areas. The first is a reaffirmation of our support for community wealth building, which is a set of socialist policies developed in my home city of Preston and implemented successfully by many local authorities, including North Ayrshire, Newham, Salford, Croydon, and many others. I'll come back to that shortly. Secondly, insourcing, not outsourcing, and support for local councils who wish to bring services back in-house, particularly where they're integrated with local supply chains and local businesses procured services from them. Thirdly, a commitment to develop policies and instruments to support the Labour Green New Deal, which I'm not going to talk about now because other speakers tonight are going to focus on this through the development of low carbon economy and reform of the energy system, limiting the power of big energy companies, and then use of the planning system to promote sustainable development, support local communities, and to ensure big developers do not abuse their positions, and to support and maintain public housing. And finally, commitments to community economic development led by local communities with support from other partners and facilitated by local political representatives, which are community-led and controlled solutions. We have a significant opportunity now to work with new organisations, such as the new mutual aid societies and organisations that have resulted from the pandemic. And with our exit from the EU and the end of state aid rules, we can promote policies to support local economic development and local businesses, cooperatives and social enterprises through the government funding that will replace the EU funding. So moving back to community wealth building, for anybody who's not aware, this is a policy instrument that is very much a left policy instrument. It came into being as a result of austerity and economic downturn in the last decade, the so-called Preston model. Key aspects of this include work with local anchor institutions in localities like your local council, colleges, universities, housing associations, and many other organisations to pool the budgets to buy local. This was important because it brought back £200 million into the local economy of Preston and the surrounding area over a number of years after it was implemented. Secondly, public procurement, ensuring that councils contract with small businesses, social enterprises, cooperatives, and other small business organisations and partnerships. This has safeguarded up to 4,000 jobs in the Preston area and the wider Lancashire area, according to a study conducted by Preston City Council. And finally, developing the so-called foundation economy. This is support for localised, well-paid, unionised jobs in worker-led cooperatives, social enterprises and local community organisations to create jobs and deliver local services. It's interesting that many centrist councils have not implemented community wealth building, or they have watered down the commitment to it, even though it's still national Labour policy. So it's very important that we need to continue to affirm and develop these policies in many more locations. Secondly, insourcing can be used to support the local economy, particularly where local supply chains and procurements are integrated with it. Given that local authority budgets are under extreme pressure currently, and even more so after the lockdown ends, we need to work with the trade union movement to ensure insourcing wherever possible and to oppose outsourcing. The third area is around enterprise zones and the Labour Green New Deal. It's interesting to note that the Tories are now developing their own version of the Green New Deal. Anybody who watched Prime Minister's Questions on Wednesday would have seen the new Tory MP for Bolsover, who took over from Dennis Skinner, ask in Parliament for Boris Johnson to support a policy initiative in his constituency to establish a green enterprise zone. This is a kind of free market solution to the issues of climate change, and one that we should be very wary of. What are enterprise zones? This is in the NPF consultation. Enterprise zones are a Tory initiative, and they were usually set up in areas where there was limited job growth, limited business startups, or limited business growth. A package of incentives and tax breaks is offered in those areas to businesses that set up in those zones. First rolled out in 2011, there are now 44 of these in England. They were criticised recently for their limited job creation between 2011 and 2017 in a study by the Centre for Cities and published by the BBC last year. They originally forecast to create 54,000 new jobs between 2012 and 15. However, the BBC commissioned research found that by 2017, only about 17,000 jobs had been created in 24 enterprise zones around England. So that's about 120 jobs a year. And in two areas, the numbers of jobs had actually fallen. So my personal view is that in these zones, they need either significant reform with much bigger focus on job creation, or indeed they should be abolished. Fourthly, the planning system. The planning system has long been due for real reform, and vested interests and big developers are very adept at exploiting the system. So we need to push reforms with genuine local democracy and ballots of local residents impacted by these developments by the private sector. There's some balloting in council-owned estates and other areas, but I believe this needs to be extended to the private sector as well to give local communities a real say. Number 5, community-led economic development led by local communities, and those same communities should control those solutions as well. Some other organisations who submitted to the National Policy Forum consultation strongly make the point that local communities are best placed to assess their own needs and make decisions around projects and funding priorities. The CV-19 crisis has heightened this awareness, and the mutual aid societies created could be strong partners for local renewal. This will need to be backed up by resources, active local authority intervention, and other partnerships which can develop. State aid rules as well can be utilised in terms of because we're leaving the EU, state aid rules will not now apply. So the government's promised replacement funding could be used to support local businesses or other local projects to get funding to start up and sustain local policies, partnerships and policies. So to sum up, we should continue to reaffirm our commitment to community wealth building, particularly around local procurement and job creation, developing the foundation economy to create local jobs, developing and extending the Labour Green New Deal through local economic forums to support community energy companies, local authority-led development, and national initiatives to combat the Tories' green enterprise zones, and support for insourcing integrated with local procurement, no financial or other support for companies registered in tax havens, which I think is a big issue as well. And finally, community economic development, partnership with local community organisations to assess local needs and develop projects while using the planning system and other mechanisms to resist big developers and big businesses that operate against the interests of local communities and put the interests of profit before people. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. That was just a brilliant run through there in very quick time as to the importance of really how you put communities and people at the heart of decision making at that local level, and that is so important. And those themes that socialist themes and socialist principles, community wealth building, community engagement in local planning and economic development, all of those themes, absolutely brilliant. We are going to put everything that you said there, hopefully, on the cosmos.co.uk so that people know where to go if they want to follow up on the themes that you've outlined just now. We're going to move swiftly to our next speaker. And our next speaker brings in the theme, and I'll come back, Gary, don't go away, because I'll be coming back to you with some questions once we've heard from the next couple of speakers. But our next speaker, Carol Wilcox, brings in the theme, the economy, business and trade. And Carol is one of our very own elected members, elected by the members onto the National Policy Forum. So Carol Wilcox, over to you.
Can you hear me?
I can indeed. Excellent.
Oh, good. Okay, right. Well, we've just had two very impressive speakers with very well prepared speeches. I'm afraid that mine is not going to be very structured. Okay, what I really want to talk about is the National Policy Forum structure process. I successfully got a place. I'm a CLP rep for the Southwest, having tried unsuccessfully twice before. I actually was unopposed. I got my place unopposed, so I didn't win an election, but it was because I was supported by the left-wing slate, so that's good. I can't say, let me see, I don't see that I have a great deal of power on the National Policy Forum. I'm very pleased to be part of it. And I want to talk about how members can be involved and get their voices heard. I've only been to 6 meetings, I think, of the National Policy Forum for this commission. We never had a joint meeting at all last year, and the meetings. I've given my opinion of the process. I don't think it's particularly good. Our meetings consist largely of having presentations, and I don't recall much discussion about actual submissions from members. I'm sure we've had a couple, but they don't seem to have made a great deal of impression on the policy making in the end. That's okay. I mean, because we've had brilliant policies, of course, come through. But I didn't feel that I was there actually to help make policy. I thought my role was actually to support the submissions of others, which I tried to do. I spent an awful lot of time responding, commenting on members' submissions, and but I have my own opinion, so I really wanted those to be heard. Can I say one thing? I don't know whether Carol Turner spoke about this last week, but what we need, apart from submissions, we need people to support others' submissions. And you can do that in two ways. You can make a comment, but also there is something, you can actually vote for them. You can vote against them as well. I've not noticed anyone doing that. In fact, I've hardly seen anybody vote at all. But when you do vote, it does say that this will be, this will register, you know, with the policy forum, how much support there is. And simply voting, yes, you know, should do something, but I don't know that many people actually do it. And I've never seen it, I've never heard it at policy meetings. Oh yes, this one's got a load of votes. So there you go. And this is really important at the moment for the Economy, Business and Trade Commission. I haven't seen anything yet in the what was it, the thing that started these this round, in the report there, anything particularly to worry about. And I've not heard anything yet that from the new Shadow Treasury team that I find particularly worrying. But of course, the international commission, there are some very troubling things there. And I don't know, I guess that Carol said this last week. So we do need people to actually, there are submissions there supporting the status quo, and we need to actually vote yes for those or make comments. So I think that's particularly important. I know it's nothing to do with this commission, but it is very important for us as socialists not to get these policies reversed. So with the, what did I particularly want to say? Yeah, so there's nothing particularly worrying about the this introductory piece from the Economy Commission. It's mainly aimed at how we deal with the coronavirus crisis, which is good. And there are a list of questions. But there's one thing that that really is my baby. I've got several things that I'm involved in, but on the economic side, I'm particularly concerned about the fiscal. It's tax and expenditure. This is really important. This is the heart of, you know, government really, political economy, and I mean, the Tory party are already showing that actually they have to accept big government now. Big government is the only game in town now. They're keeping the economy, you know, going by their expenditure. And Labour, you know, really, you know, they're going to be hanging on to their coattails, because the amount of money that they pumped into the economy is far more than ever was. You know, they were saying that Labour would, you know, found the magic money tree. Well, you know, the magic money tree is there. I don't know how much longer I got to talk, because I do ramble.
Well, actually, you've done a brilliant run through, really, of your experiences on the National Policy Forum, in particular that commission on the economy. So I'm hoping that we can leave it there, if that's okay.
Yes, that's fine.
Carol.
Yes.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you so much in giving us that outline. Can I turn swiftly to our speaker that's going to bring in the issues around the environment and energy and that particular commission. And our next speaker, therefore, is Suzanne Buckingham. Now, Suzanne is a writer, a researcher, an advisor, and an active campaigner on the environmental issues. So, Susan, over to you, and it's great to have you.
Thanks, Claudia, and to everyone, a happy World Environment Day. Let's hope that this year it might achieve something. I'm going to focus on the environment, and the Policy Commission opens with a statement that climate and environment breakdown must be returned to once the crisis eases, and recovery must be a green one. It's good that this is referred to as a priority, but some argued that COVID-19 is not separate from climate and environmental breakdown, and so this cannot be abandoned while the pandemic is supposedly dealt with. Arguably, causes of COVID-19 are related to how we are, for example, destroying wild habitats or treating long-distance travel as a right. I know people in the UK who are still taking cheap flights to North Italy for a weekend skiing in February, despite reports of COVID-19 deaths there. And treating the economy as something more important than and not to serve human and indeed all life and health when easing lockdown is both illogical and unacceptable. Not waiting until the crisis eases is also important, as development proposals, planning applications, and proceeding with large carbon-intensive infrastructural projects are certainly not waiting. One could argue that they're taking advantage of COVID-19 to smuggle through proposals which are heavily opposed. I'm thinking not only of HS2, but also a £170 million plus carbon-intensive fixed track for a guided bus in my hometown of Cambridge. This will destroy local woodlands and biodiversity, and there is scant evidence that it will reduce car use. A decent, frequent, flexible electric bus service would be a much quicker solution, serving many more communities, as Ian has already illustrated. Meanwhile, in another part of town, a proposal has just been published for a new suburb of 8,000 homes. This number represents 14% of the current homes in Cambridge, 1 in 78 of which is reported to be empty. Also, the proposed 20,000 new jobs there clearly indicate an expected rise in commuting. This is an area where water levels are already dangerously low. The Policy Commission identifies the 2019 manifesto as part of Labour's proud record on climate and environmental issues. One of the things that most impressed me about the manifesto is the way in which it linked economic, social, and natural issues, and recognised how policies to address one had to address all. The Policy Commission recognises that ecological renewal must be accompanied by solidarity and social justice, and demands that living standards must improve, and that Britain should be built in a way that is both low in carbon and rich in good jobs. But this begs a number of questions. Improving living standards for whom? Last year's manifesto talks about levelling up, which suggests it's the living standards of the relatively poor which need enhancing, of course. However, it's critical for our environment and nature more widely that the gap between the poorest paid and the highest paid worker becomes smaller by higher earners earning less, as well as low earners earning more. And then, what constitutes a good job? One which is meaningful and purposeful, one which pays fairly, has security, and leaves the worker time to enjoy a life beyond paid work. Jobs which do not discriminate, but are open to and encourage women, disabled people, Black and minority ethnic people, jobs that all people can combine flexibly with caring responsibilities and non-paid work activities, jobs that do not require a time-consuming and carbon-intensive commute. They should be all these things and more. Nationally and internationally too, we need measures which replace gross national and gross domestic product, which only account for financial transactions. Currently, cleanups of or litigation against environmental pollution count as a positive in the balance, while unpaid domestic and care work, which the Office for National Statistics estimates as representing more than a notional £1 trillion a year, counts for nothing. Domestic and care work, which is more often done by women and which is increased by environmentally aware housekeeping, not to mention pandemics. Cooking from scratch, using reusable nappies, separating the waste streams, all take more time and effort, however rewarding the outcomes. We need to value unpaid work and ensure that this is evenly distributed so that women, the mainstay of unpaid cleaning, cooking, caring, have the opportunity to engage in other work. Local measures or indicators can capture value other than financial. I remember in the early days of planning for a sustainable 21st century, after the Earth Summit in 1992 through Agenda 21, Seattle developed an indicator which would show how a local waterway had recovered by counting the number of swans who return. We also need to tackle that great elephant in the room, rampant consumerism. We need to be paid fairly for work done so that we can pay fairly for products we buy. So that women in faraway places, often risking their life to sew t-shirts with, I've heard them say this, with their blood, and at huge cost to the environment, in pesticides used, in water abstracted, so that they can also receive a fair wage. But we also need to drastically reduce the number of things that we buy and the frequency with which we buy them. Clothes, computers, mobile phones, domestic appliances. We need to identify other ways to value ourselves and others than by the make of a car or a dress. And to be able to find ways of repairing and repurposing. Care work, low paid and unpaid, needs to count as green work along with jobs identified in the Policy Commission, in nature conservation, home insulation and wind turbine manufacture. In fact, a recent report by the Women's Environmental Network and the Women's Budget Group refers to professional care work as green jobs. And as well as retrofitting homes to be energy efficient, we could train people for jobs which retrofit outside spaces so that all households have gardens which combine biodiversity, play, and food in beautiful ways. It was good to see in the last manifesto that there were to be targeted bursaries for green apprenticeships for disadvantaged peoples and groups, such as women, Black and minority ethnic people, and disabled people. I know from the work I do on gender and environment that women are so far not well represented in these green jobs, so conscious efforts to make these actively welcoming to all are very important. Respecting and sharing the caring is critical to this. For example, making longer paid paternity leave and shorter working weeks standard. It's good to see the Policy Commission put sustainability and equality at the heart of its policy. There are many initiatives that can contribute to socially just transition and a feminist Green New Deal, while simultaneously reducing carbon emissions, improving quality of life, and promoting social justice. COVID-19 has demonstrated how modern living arrangements don't always facilitate sociability, just as we know that they are not environmentally sustainable. People who live on their own, who live in cramped accommodation with no outside space, who live on polluted streets, or who live with violent and otherwise abusive partners, groups which feature disproportionate numbers of women and Black and minority ethnic people, the poor, the elderly, the disabled. They could really benefit from imaginative housing arrangements which respect privacy and maximise flexibility and the benefits of community, such as co-housing, with communal spaces, energy efficiency, shared equipment and functions, such as laundries and kitchens. Extending from this, widespread community-owned or supported transport, businesses, farming and energy would all help to achieve an environmentally sustainable and socially equitable society. Through food, for example, it's so shocking, it's already been mentioned, that people in our country, the world's 6th richest, go hungry. The generosity of food donations, however welcome, doesn't compensate for people not having secure and dignified access to sufficient nutrition and culturally appropriate food, and food which has been farmed in ways that don't destroy nature. It's difficult to capture in a linear narrative just how much these social, economic, and environmental initiatives and changes will need to be woven together to secure, in the Policy Commission's words, ecological renewal, solidarity, and social justice. But I'd urge the Labour Party and the National Policy Forum to treat them as indivisible and inextricably linked. No trading, one without the others just won't work. In fact, just like a healthily functioning ecosystem. Please make your views known to the NPF to ensure this. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Susan. Thank you for outlining the importance there, really, of our Environment, Energy and Culture Commission there, and really outlining the importance of holding on to those policies that are so vital to keeping us clear on our agenda around the environment and around change and around what is needed in terms of progressive policies on the left. I was going to take a few more questions, but I'm looking at the time, and I can see that we've got some questions from the audience, but I really do want to give us the opportunity to hear our final speaker, and I'm just with the permission of the audience, would want us to go straight to our final speaker, if that is at all possible. Could I just say to the audience, we have a chat function which is putting up links to the various areas in which you can find more information, which are important to the Policy Commission. We're obviously encouraging you to respond to the National Policy Forum and the commissions that are outlined. Those links will be helpful. Everything that everybody has said this evening will be helpful. We are going to, we've got some open questions that I can see in our question and answers section. I'm going to call on, whilst I call on our final speaker, I'm going to ask our speakers that preceded, if you could just look at some of those questions and if you can provide a written response, and if I could ask you to look at those questions and converse with those that have put them and provide a written response so that at least those questions can get answered. Everybody can see those responses and those questions. And without further ado, therefore, with the permission of the audience, I want to bring us to our final speaker. I've said a great deal at the beginning about our final speaker, so I'm not going to say much more now, except he's the one that has inspired us all on the economy and what we can do for a socialist future. And together with Jeremy and Diane have been a huge inspiration for our movement and where we are now. So without further ado, our final speaker, John McDonald.
Thanks, Claudia. That's really helpful. It's been really good listening to the other speakers and some of the questions that have come in. Let me just let me address straight away the climate that we're in, that we're addressing. In the materials that have come out from the National Policy Forum, as exactly has been said, obviously and naturally and quite rightfully, they're focused upon the immediate challenges that we face as a result of the pandemic. So this is about, and people shouldn't be worried about this in any way, this is about moving on from the 2017 and 2019 manifestos, but building upon them. This isn't about, I don't think this is in any way the party trying to tear up past policies. I think it's about building upon them in this new climate. And it's the point that was just been made by Carol and others. Actually, things have moved on as a result of this pandemic. Some of the principles that have been, I suppose, upheld now within our community are the ones that we were advocating previously, but now have become much more relevant to people. So the point that was made, first of all, with regard to austerity, people now are beginning to appreciate just how bad the last 10 years have been and what they've meant for our public services in particular, and how ill-prepared our NHS and our social care services were for this pandemic because of 10 years of cuts and austerity. I think they've also realised as well just how badly some of our public servants have been treated, particularly in the health service, particularly in social care, but right the way across our public services, with the pay freezes over the last 10 years and cuts and exploitation and privatisation. And people have woken up to that. So things have moved on quite dramatically in people's attitude to the way our economy is run. But also, it's interesting, the point that Carol made, which is very interesting, that people have recognised that all these arguments that have been put to us by neoliberals, that it's about individualism and individuals getting on, people now know that the way in which we should deal with issues is collectively. And one of the collective arms, if you like, of how we come together is the state itself. So these neoliberals who are arguing for a smaller state, the small state, cut back on the state so they can then reduce taxes and give tax cuts to rich and corporations, they're on the retreat. And we've got to recognise that. And we've not got to allow the right to exploit this crisis. Far from it. We've got to ensure that people thoroughly learn the lessons from the crisis. So what does that mean to us for economic policy? First of all, people are going to look back on the last 10 years of austerity, and I think they are saying never again. No more austerity. But there are some within government, there's no doubt about it, because they flew a kite, didn't they, a couple of weeks ago, about possibly restoring austerity in ways in which they thought they could get away with. And one of them was about a pay freeze across the public sector for the next 2 years. And there was other discussions about rounds of cuts within public services. They flew that kite, and the reaction they got was people saying, no, no way, and there would be opposition. So they've backed off. So what they're now doing, and it's quite clever really, all of a sudden these Tories who are neoliberals up until now, including people like Rishi Sunak and these admirers of Thatcher over the years, are now all of a sudden converted Keynesians. So they're supporting a fiscal stimulus, borrowing money to put money into the economy. Part of that is because they're forced to, because of the crisis we face, but also I think what they want to do is maintain the fiscal stimulus, but to their own advantage. And that will be about restoring and maintaining profits rather than actually raising wages, and also ensuring that people get a more equal share of the rewards of the wealth that they create. So they become Keynesians, but Keynesians with a selfish purpose. And that's the sort of argument that will be put forward. So what we've got to do is say, number one of our future economic policy is hold to the policy of ending austerity. No support for any form of austerity measures or cuts in public services or wage freezes. In fact, quite the reverse. What we should be arguing for is increases in wages in the future to restore some of the cuts that have taken place over the last 10 years. That's the first thing. The issue around how do we make sure everybody is lifted out of poverty, but also has a decent quality of life. And we've had this debate within the party. We put in the last manifesto the idea of piloting universal basic income projects in a number of cities that volunteered to do that. And I think that's the right way forward for UBI, because not everyone is convinced. On the left in particular, not everyone is convinced about UBI. So we need, I think the idea of pilots is quite right. But what we could do is take the first step towards making sure everyone has a decent income. And the way that we would do that is a minimum income guarantee, so that whether you're in work or whether you're out of work or dependent on some forms of benefits, you have a minimum income guarantee to everybody that will give you a decent quality of life. And as I say, this is not something dramatically original. It's a debate that's going on right the way across Europe and elsewhere. And it would open the door then to a discussion about universal basic income once I think the pilots that could be introduced have convinced people. That's the first thing. In terms of the next stage, then I think one of the things we've got to recognise now is that attitudes have changed also as a result of the pandemic towards not just investment in public services, but ownership of public services. I think there's a reaction against the privatisation of our NHS, yes, but also we've seen during this crisis, even this government has had to, well, effectively bring rail back into public ownership and management, and they've had to use taxpayers' money to grant aid bus services, you know, because otherwise both levels of transport services wouldn't have been able to continue on. So our argument must be we've got to recognise that public ownership of our basic public services is absolutely key to ensuring that we get decent levels of service, but also that actually we get them in a way in which they benefit everybody. The other issue about ownership as well is we've got to argue, I think, is to recognise that when people go back to work after this lockdown, they will want to ensure that they have a fairer share of rewards, but also they have a greater say over what is happening within their workplace. And that means, yes, adhering to the proposals we put forward for inclusive ownership schemes where shares are held by workers collectively, which has become well, commonplace now in terms of political debate, both in Europe but also in America. Even the Sanders campaign took it up. But also what we've got to do is make sure that that ownership translates into workers on boards, both as shareholders collectively, but also the rights of having workers elected to boards from their workforce to ensure they have say over the future of economic policy of that particular company or firm. And in that way, we're democratizing the economy even further. In fact, I think people are up for this now. They're more radicalized because I don't think people now are willing to be pushed around anymore by employers who, in some instances during this pandemic, have treated people abysmally, dragging them into work even against their own health. The third area I think that we developed, and it's been mentioned earlier, but as part of economic policy, it's key to it. And I can't see the party falling back from it. I think, in fact, it's most probably about speedier implementation now, and that's about the re-establishment of trade union rights in this country as basic human rights. And if you look at what we brought forward with the Institute of Employment Rights, the policies about fulfilling John Smith, our late leader's promise about employment rights from day one of employment for all categories of workers, sectoral collective bargaining, sector by sector negotiating wage levels, and then individual firm negotiations going on after that. Restoring and making sure there's the right to withdraw one's labour for everybody. There are certain trade unions in this country, like the POA, the Prison Officers Association, still haven't got that right. But also, it is about recognising the exploitation that's gone on during this pandemic, but also particularly in the gig economy. So that does mean ending zero-hour contracts. It means making sure that we have proper legal status for all workers that gives them access to trade union rights. And in that way, it fulfills what we all know, that the best way to protect your income and to protect your working environment and your working conditions is join a trade union. I think this will incentivize even more people to join a trade union. And what's interesting during this crisis is that people have woken up to the fact that actually it's the trade union voice and trade union representation that is ensuring people are safe at work, ensuring actually that when they go back to work, there are proper risk assessments taking place. And so again, and I think that's reflected in what's been happening. If you look at the National Education Union, they've had something like 10,000, if more, extra members join their union over the last couple of weeks. And it just shows you, I think there's an increasing understanding now what trade unions is all about. But we've got to make sure, as part of central to our economic policy, is that restoration of trade union rights in this country. The next point, and finally, in the last couple of points very quickly, we were developing the concept of universal basic services so that the basics in life shouldn't be commodities to be bought and sold and people's receipt of them dependent on whether or not they can pay for them or not. That's why Labour established the NHS. That's exactly what we want to do with regard to social care services, so they're properly paid for through general taxation. The same with education. We've got to ensure that we adhere to the principle that education is a gift from one generation to another, not a commodity to be bought and sold. That's why education, the National Education Service, free right the way through. We've got to ensure we adhere to scrapping of tuition fees. But now we know that resources can be found. I think we need to start talking about scrapping the debt that is mounted up for young people as a result of tuition fees. And you know, it's interesting, isn't it? Because a lot of that debt anyway is going to be written off. The Tories wrote off a lot of tuition fee debt only a few months ago because the system's collapsing. And what I found fascinating was Lord Adonis, who was the minister who was responsible for bringing in tuition fees in the detail of it. Even now he's saying the system isn't working, it should be scrapped. So I think we've got to extend this whole concept of universal basic services. It's the thing that Tosh said, you know, it's water into public ownership, energy, transport. As the point that Ian said as well, with transport, by having it under public ownership and control, because we've got to tackle a climate change crisis, so at some stage we've got to start talking about transport being free, taking people out of their units and putting them in public transport services. It's I think it could be one of the most dramatic contributions to tackling climate change itself. And I have to smile, Tosh raised it, I do have to smile, that in this pandemic, one of the most important things people have realized is access to the internet and broadband. And you know, when I mentioned it in a speech last night, that when I introduced the idea of full fibre broadband for the whole of the country, starting the layout, because only 10% of it is out there at the moment under the private sector, starting the rollout in those areas which had the least access at the moment, and then rolling it out. You know, it was described in one newspaper as full fibre Marxism. Actually, now people realise access to the internet is just part of life. It ends isolation. It accesses all those different avenues into the state for benefits, etc., but also for education and cultural purposes as well. So again, it's one of those universal basic services that we should adhere to. Let me just say this as well, I think in terms of this argument about we've had for years that there's no, you know, the resources aren't available, we now know that when needed, the resources will be found. Yeah. It's about political will. Now, the argument is, well, we'll borrow large amounts of money to get through this crisis. Of course we will, every country will. Interest rates are low, so this is the time to borrow. But what you do is you borrow and then you invest and you grow your economy, and in that way you can tackle the relation of the GDP to debt to GDP ratio. You can bring that down by growing the economy overall. But that leads me on really to grow the economy also. You need to be straight with people. We do need taxation to enable us to pay for the public services and to invest in the long term. So we said we would increase taxation on the top 5%. I think that's the right thing. And actually, it was interesting, that was widely supported in opinion poll to opinion poll. But we've also said that actually people who gain their income from capital gains as against income, well, all income should be taxed in the same way. Whether you earn it or whether you get it to a capital gain, you all should be treated and taxed at the same level. It's interesting, Resolution Foundation commissioned a piece of research, and they found that what's happened in the inequalities over the last 10 years in particular that have been developed within a society, a lot of that is based upon capital gains being taxed so lightly as against income, and therefore those with assets have been able to get wealthier and wealthier. Final thing on the taxation point, let me just say this. We said we would review all tax reliefs. One of the things that the Resolution Foundation research found is that one of the tax reliefs we targeted was the one that would actually give the wealthiest the biggest benefit, and that was entrepreneurs' tax relief. And Mariana Mazzucato, one of the prime economists in this country, has attacked this tax relief. It's nothing to do with entrepreneurs. It's more to do with how people sell on companies and then can make a killing after that. And it produces no real benefit to our society. You take that package together and that will give us the resources that we need to invest in the long term. And just on this final point as well, in the discussions that we're having, it's been mentioned earlier, whatever we do with regard to our economic policy, we've got to recognise part of it is to deal with the existing crisis that's caused by the pandemic, but the pandemic crisis, to be frank, is just a dress rehearsal for the big crisis that we face, which is the threat of climate catastrophe. So everything we do now has got to have at its core the tackling of that climate change crisis that we face. And we're running out of time, rapidly running out of time. So the harnessing of our resources has got to be towards investment to tackle the climate catastrophe that we face. And it's completely doable, but the right political will, we can overcome this. And in fact, I think we can become world leaders in exemplifying just how you can turn a fossil economy, the first fossil economy, into one which is dependent upon alternative energy sources, and at the same time is conserving, both in terms of how we produce our food, how we develop our land policy, and how we effectively live together. That's the sort of economic policy that we've got to move to now. So this isn't just about holding on to what we achieved in 17 and 19 manifestos. We've got to be much more radical than that, and it's moving it on. And in that way, I think we, as rank and file members of the party now, we can create a climate of opinion that isn't just convince us party members and supporters, but actually will convince people that we're potentially ready for government now to replace possibly one of the most incompetent and weakest leaderships of the Conservative parties I've ever seen. Because the leadership of the Conservative Party in a pandemic like this that's actually dangerous for the country itself. Thanks, Claudia.
That's absolutely brilliant, John. Excellent. Can I just ask if you've got time for just to take one or two questions before we close, if that's okay? We had a question that came in a little earlier, and it really related to a question around universal basic income, and whether or not we think that that is a policy that we should be pursuing, and what your thoughts are around that. And then there was a question probably around the question of how do we get better education so that we can make better political and economic choices. I wonder if you can just touch on those two, if that's okay.
No problem, thanks. On universal basic income, I'm a strong advocate of universal basic income, but it is contentious. And it's interesting, with strong advocates from the left, but there's also strong advocates from the right. And the right argue for universal basic income because they see it as bringing in a low level of basic income and then scrapping all the other benefits of the welfare state that we constructed. So they see it as an opportunity to kill off the welfare state. From the left, we see it as a way of actually lifting people out of poverty, and at the same time introducing greater equality within our society. But you'll always have to have, alongside universal basic income at a generous level, you're always going to have additional financial support to deal with all the different special circumstances that people find themselves in, particularly those at the moment who, for example, people with disabilities who've been the hardest hit. But I understand people are concerned about bringing it in, the cost of it, the scale of it. That's why in the last manifesto, I was very careful to say that, look, I understand people aren't convinced. Why don't we try a few pilots in a couple of cities, and then we can see whether or not it works, how it works, what are the wrinkles in it that we need to iron out. And when I said that, what was interesting is that I thought there might be some trepidation amongst our city leaders in particular, or mayors or councillors about that. Quite the reverse. We had Sheffield, Liverpool, a whole range of towns and cities were saying we want to pilot that because we cannot continue on with this level of, one, poverty and deprivation, but also the grotesque levels of inequality that we were facing. So that's the way I see it for. But my stepping stone to UBI is, I say, is this idea of guaranteed minimum income, guaranteed earnings, minimum earnings guarantee. And if you look at some of the research that's been done in the think tanks over the last few months, It's looking at how you can bring about a guaranteed earnings for everybody, and that includes people benefits. And in some ways, that is then leveling benefits up towards income in work. Again, that's quite challenging, but it's the only way, as far as I can see, is tackling the levels of inequality that we've got within our society. In terms of this educational issue, look, we've got to, this is a bit of self-criticism here. I don't think we did enough, Jeremy and myself, to really shake up the Labour bureaucracy, to turn the Labour Party into an educational vehicle. For political education, for years, was neglected within the Labour Party. And when Jeremy became leader, we thought this would be one of our real things, that we could get the Labour Party as really a vehicle in which we could educate our members, train our members into real cadres, how they understand the world, political analysis, and then the detail of policy, so that they become advocates. We had as you know, well, you know it from the leaked report, we had a battle with the bureaucracy that we inherited for 2 years that was completely resistant to everything that we were doing. But then after that, of course, we tried to develop the educational role of the party, but I don't think we were quick enough, and then we lost power. So now I think that's one of our basic campaigns. One of the things we did, which I think was really successful, we supported the World Transformed and the formation of that to play an educational role. So I look now to the World Transformed as one of those organizations that can actually creatively develop the level of political education in our society. But obviously my focus is the political education around understanding the economy, because once you understand how the economic system works, that's the foundation, the political economy of that, that's the foundation then for how you can really change society at its foundations. So that's the work I'll be doing in this coming period, and with the World Transform, and with a couple of other projects that I'm involved in at the moment. It's really exciting. But what I find amazing, though, we've now got a new architecture of think tanks, which we lost in the 90s and 2000s. Over the last few years, one of our successes is the encouragement of the different think tanks. The IPPR now, radicalized under Tom Kabasian is there, CLASS, New Economics Foundation, Autonomy, Commonwealth, you name it. There's a whole breadth of think tanks now producing work that raises the level of debate. Progressive Economic Forum, one of the ones that I helped set up, Positive Money, all of those. So we've got, I think the opportunity is there now. And I think, as I say, some of us, that'll be what we do. We concentrate on developing the political education role that we have.
That is so brilliant. Thank you so much for that, John, and for giving us that inspiring speech, and really setting out the basis on why we should stay involved and remain involved and participate in responding to this National Policy Forum. The topics we have discussed today cover so many of the inspiring radical policies which the Labour Party has, under Jeremy Corbyn, has developed over the last 5 years, from the green industrial and transport revolution to taking rail, yes, mail, yes, water and energy back into public ownership, and a just taxation system both in the UK and internationally. This is, I believe, the bedrock of the radical solutions which our broken society so desperately need. We have so many fantastic policies which need defending and expanding. And I think it is up to all of us to fight for this future within the Labour Party. And events such as these are crucial in that struggle. That's why it's so important to thank the cosmos for the work that it's doing on this. And I would just like to end by saying that John was entirely correct with his final words as Shadow Chancellor in Parliament, when he said, "It is solidarity that will see us through this crisis, protect our community, and on which we should build our society in the future." That is why it is crucial for us to take the energy and ideas from tonight's meeting and to engage wholeheartedly with the National Policy Forum, because we know that the crisis we face require radical solutions, and it is only a bold member-led party that will be able to deliver them. So I want to finally end by thanking you, our audience that has participated with us since 7:30, been here with us. Thank you so much for participating with us, and to thank also our wonderful speakers, to Tosh, to Ian, to Gary, to Carol, and to Susan, and finally to John. Thank you, everyone, and good night all. Thank you so much.